Oh, well, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be here, and I hope what I have to say is of interest. And it's going to pick up a little bit on what was just discussed by the previous speaker about research and some hopes we have for maybe doing some collaborative research. So I'm going to talk about the human health effects of particulate air pollution, which is basically particles in the air, sometimes called particulate matter. And Next slide. There we go. Um, these particles are come from many different sources and around the world. And when we talk about the health effects of air pollution, most of the adverse effects are from particles in the air. I mean, there are other pollutants that also have effects, but for example, this analysis that was done for the global burden of disease, found that there were millions of people who die, up to 7 million people dying prematurely every year around the world from indoor and outdoor pollution. And the biggest effects are to heart disease, and that is from long-term exposure to particles. Based on research that I and other people in the field have done, indicating for more pollution, how many more people are at risk of dying. Let's see. Okay, so I think we're familiar with the basic concept that the air pollution gets into your body. I mean, your head and throat are set up to try and actually keep these particles out. That's why you breathe through your nose, it turns, and then it goes through the trachea, and it's a tortuous path into the lungs. So our body's really set up to capture particles, but they're really designed for large particles like windblown sand and dust, like we were exposed to for all time. But in more recent years, we've using combustion of things like coal and also industrial pollution, and the very small particles that result can bypass those defenses and get deep into the lung, go through the pharynx into the trachea, then down into the bronchi, and then get deep into the lung and actually impact in the alveoli, which is where the gas transfer of oxygen goes on. It's very thin membranes, and they're very susceptible to damage from things like particle air pollution. And these particles, not only do they have their own toxicity, but they also are vectors. They're enablers of other pollutants to take a ride on them and absorb. Normally, your body would absorb these gases in the upper airways in your nose and throat, but they get on a particle. The particle then take them into your lungs. So they not only have their own toxicity, they're enablers of the toxicity of other pollutants in the air. So they have a sort of a double whammy on our health. And the thing is, once they get down into the alveolar region, then they can solubilize. The very small ultrafine particles can actually pass through almost like small molecules and get into the bloodstream. And then also they solubilize and go into a liquid form, and then can go into the bloodstream. And then they go systemically. So there's a really broad range, like the cardiac, they go to the heart and cause inflammation and health damage. So who is most affected? Well, older adults. I used to say the elderly, but now this is way too close to home. So I prefer older adults. And those with pre-existing respiratory disease, like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and emphysema is one form. And that's a pretty common disease from smoking, for example. But you can also get it from air pollution. And if somebody smokes and gets exposed to air pollution, then it's really much worse. Then children, and especially infants, because they're developing, and they're actually studies like done in California, the Children's Health Study, have found that in places where the pollution is higher, then the lungs don't develop as well in those children. One of the things they can do, they found, is to induce children who wouldn't otherwise get asthma to get asthma. And that's a lifetime sentence. Once you have asthma, it doesn't ever go away. It changes a little bit as you get older, but in its presentation, but you still have that disease, and it's a lifetime a disease, really, and something we should really try and avoid. And so children are especially susceptible, and also, as I think I have a slide here, they're very active, so they get lots of exposure. And then healthy adults are affected, especially those who work or exercise outdoors. So, it's good to go out and exercise. I really recommend that. I try and do it every day. But if it's high pollution, then you're getting a bigger dose because you're breathing in more air. And so there's a trade-off there. And the benefits of exercise are diminished as the pollution levels go up. And then people with inadequate health care. And I've done studies in New York, and people have done other places. And for the same amount of pollution, the poor and the working poor have much worse outcomes. So we're all affected by it. But if you don't have good health care, what the tendency is, or if you don't have money, you say, well, maybe I'll feel better tomorrow. And what happens instead is you get worse. Whereas if you have good health care, then you say, ooh, I better go see the doctor, and you go to the doctor and get some medication, perhaps, and get it evaluated. So really, when you look at the risks of pollution in general, it's the poor and the working poor and those with inadequate health care coverage who are really most affected. But we're all affected by it, but the implications are worse, is really what I'm saying. Your bodies are affected the same way, but the health outcomes are worse if you don't go, get proper care, for example. And as I was saying, children breathe more, about twice as much at 6 months. You think of a 6-month-old child, they're not out running around yet, but yet their metabolism is so high, they breathe much more air. And not just when they're screaming. Okay, I've raised enough kids. So they, and it's about twice the amount. So they're breathing in a lot more air, getting more dose per body weight, per pound of weight. And when they get a little older, they spend more time outside, getting exposures perhaps. And as I said, they're growing and developing, and that can inhibit that. And then now we're even finding, and this children's health study in California has been very informative about this, that exposures to mothers when the child's in utero can actually have adverse impacts on the child. It's just logical, really, if you think about it, because they found, like, for women who smoke during pregnancy, then they tend to have smaller infants, and so we know that exposures during pregnancy can influence the child, and it carries on through life. That's the thing, that they're finding, that you start out behind in the race, it's hard to catch up. So what about particles? Well, as I already alluded to, that there are particles in the air. Some are solid particles that, like, maybe come out of a exhaust of a diesel truck. You'll see those black soot kind of particles, or they can be liquid droplets where you get gaseous formation, like sulfur dioxide comes out, but then it will condense in the air and you'll get a droplet. And to tell you the truth, a lot of those particles are just at the size of the wavelength of sunlight, about a half a micron in diameter. And I'll show you some sizes to compare. But basically, because these combustion particles are so tiny, they interfere with the wavelength of light and disperse it. So that reduces visibility. So on polluted days, you may have noticed, and out west, I've been out west, and it's a beautiful country, and the views are wonderful, except, we have the fires that are going on, wildfires. I was out in Wyoming last year, and I've been there before, and I remember how the views were beautiful, but they weren't so that week because there was fires going on. So those particles interfere with your ability to see, not only during wildfires, also just other particles can do it on a lesser scale. As I said before, the very small particles are the ones that are capable of defeating your defenses and getting in deep in the lung. And they themselves are toxic. And as I said, they can carry other gases and vapors along with them. And then they're hard to clear out. The body really, defenses are not very effective against these small particles. So here's just a visual, give you an idea versus a human hair. And here's what, compared to the combustion particles, beach sand looks like boulders, right? And if you look at PM10, used to be the standard particles 10 microns or less, and those are the ones that could get past the trachea, 10 micrometers or less. And then and how those particles compare to 50 to 70 micrometer width of a human hair. And then the PM 2.5, which is the one that's regulated more strongly now, the smaller particles are, you can see many of those within a PM10, and then within those PM 2.5, you can have many combustion particles that are about a half a micron or about the same size as the wavelength of light from the sun, the primary wavelength. So you see, we're dealing with very, very small particles, but very toxic actually at the same time. And the particles are of two types. One is that come right out of the tailpipe, like I mentioned, diesel, or secondary particles that form, especially in the summertime when it's there's a lot of humidity or more humidity, and also it's warmer, so that it sort of cooks in the air and forms and condenses into these particles, such as sulfur dioxide from power plants. And there's lots of power plants upwind of where you are right now, with these coal-fired power plants in Wyoming and other states, Utah, and they're still putting out a lot of pollution, and that you're sort of in the tailpipe of that. They come towards the east, from the west to the east primarily. As I mentioned before, there are what we call natural sources of air pollution, and things from volcanic eruptions, forest fires, and also dust storms. And actually, this particular Gobi Desert dust storm, I was actually was able to measure one in April of 2001, and we actually were able to, using trace elements, to identify that those particles that were hitting New York had come all the way from China, because you monitor them. There are monitors across the country, and as it hit the West Coast, and then it hit the middle of the country, and then it hit New York, and we were monitoring. We said, what are these high levels of silicon? And then I looked at multiple stations, and they were all being hit, so it wasn't local. So you have local and transported pollution. Some of the sources I think you're familiar with: electric power generating plants, I already mentioned, especially coal plants, and factories, manufacturing complexes, oil refineries, chemical plants, incinerators. So I'm talking really outdoor air pollution here. And then mobile sources, and these, anywhere has these, on-road vehicles like trucks and buses, off-road vehicles, and then non-road vehicles, airplanes and ships. Ships are actually very polluting out to sea, and they're not as well regulated. Yeah, here's a, this is a little complicated one. I apologize. But basically, it's showing the different size ranges of particles. And the combustion particles tend to be these here's 0.1 micrometer, right? And here's about 0.5. So these are the particles I was talking about. The 0.1 are the ones that come right out of the tailpipe. And we measure these like right along roadways. But they quickly bump into each other. They're so small, they're moving around like molecules, and they bump into each other, and they grow up to about this 0.5 size range. And then you've got the windblown soil and things like that that are much larger. So that's why we tend to regulate these smaller particles. They have all the more toxic, and they reach deeper in the lungs. And you can see here is where they deposit in the lung. And so the very small particles, here's 1 micrometer, okay, here's 0.5. They tend, the smaller the particles are, the more they tend to get down deep into your lung. And again, these are the combustion particles that we're so worried about. And then the larger particles, like windblown soil, they get caught in the nose. So it, our defenses work very well against these particles, not so much with these. They get deep in the lung where we don't want them. And so what are the health effects? I've already alluded to this. I mean, certainly death is a case of people dying, and that's the worst outcome. And it's actually one of the best studied because we keep careful records of those. But then for every death, there's many more hospital admissions and more doctor's visits. And then not recorded anywhere probably, unless you're doing a study of it, asthma attacks, medication use to deal with asthma symptoms. And then lung function changes, which is changing basically your ability to breathe in and out. And pollution tends to inhibit that acutely. And then certainly over a long period of time exposure. So everybody is at risk from it, but it's a different scale of severity depending on your susceptibility and also on the level of the pollution. And here's something from a statement that we worked on in the American Thoracic Society that I led. And we went through and I was saying how, these particles, once they get into your bloodstream, they go everywhere. And these are just some of the diseases that have been documented and suspected. The documented ones are in the dark. So we're talking about respiratory disease, of course, in the lung directly. Lung cancer, that's relatively recently we've been able to show that, like cigarette smoking, the ambient particles increase your risk of lung cancer. A pneumonia risk is increased. And then diabetes, I've done some studies on that, on the increased risk of dying from diabetes. And high blood pressure is a risk factor for cardiovascular. So you see over here, heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, arrhythmias, and chronic disease. And then also getting into the brain and a stroke, increasing the risk of stroke and neurodegenerative diseases. And then we talked about before, premature birth, decreased birth weight, and these kinds of effects on unborn children from exposures to the mothers. So, this is sort of a picture view, a quick summary from the EPA that I think is really instructive. Just talking about the respiratory effects, and then most of the deaths that we have from air pollution tend to be from cardiac, partially because many Americans are at risk from cardiac because of our diet and our lack of exercise and things like that. So air pollution, you tend to be, close to having a severe illness, and then pollution is the last straw kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why I think cardiac effects are the leading adverse result of air pollution. And as I mentioned before, it affects your lung function, your ability to breathe in and out. It causes inflammation. There's irritation in the lining of the lung, and you get fluid buildup, edema, and then also it increases susceptibility to respiratory infection. So this is one of the concerns we have with COVID, is that it does seem that places with more particle pollution, people tend to get more COVID, and they're trying to sort out how that happens, but there does seem to be an interaction. First of all, when you breathe, and I have a couple of slides I'll show, when you breathe or cough or sneeze, out come particles, and those can be laden with virus, and the really small ones can stay around in the air for a long time. And then in the heart, it can affect cardiovascular function, and the rhythms of the heart. Basically, I sort of, as a fast engineer, I sort of do this as the electrical system of the heart, and then that also affects the plumbing of the heart, and can increase atherosclerosis, plaque buildup. So you get blockage, and then perhaps rupture is the worst ultimate result, because that clot can then travel down and block up. That plaque can travel downstream and then catch somewhere and block the flow and cause a heart attack. So these particles, some of the effects are acute, like from day to day, but most of them have to do with years and years of exposure. Now, I've done a study with the American Cancer Society cohort, and I won't go into a lot of details. About 500,000 people across the country for decades they followed, and we said, well, once we take into account all the things that the study has looked at, like smoking and alcohol and occupation, whether you're married or not, and all these other risk factors that influence cardiovascular. We said, well, after you control for all of those, what is there anything that pollution explains? And we found that particles really influenced and increased the risk of dying of cardiovascular and also lung cancer. So ischemic, that's like heart attacks, mortality. I use the tracers I mentioned before. You can use trace elements. Coal has mercury in it. It has selenium, arsenic, really toxic things, but they're fairly unique to coal identifiers. And then traffic has nitrogen oxides are related to it, and also elemental carbon soot, diesel soot, right? And then soil, silicon, and biomass has potassium. And what we found was that of all the types of particles we were able to identify, using these fingerprints, coal particles and to a lesser extent traffic were the ones that were really influencing. In other words, fossil fuel combustion particles. Another concern in a lot of parts of the world is from indoor cooking stoves. You get really high exposures. It's sort of like cigarette smoking in that you get very high, it's vegetative matter that you're burning, and you're getting high exposures. And so it's a lot like cigarette smoke in that regard, although it doesn't have the nicotine in it. But these places where people use this oftentimes are not sufficiently ventilated. Because traditionally women and children, women are doing the cooking and they have to take care of the children. So they get bigger exposures as well as, here I have the elderly, I've got to change that one. To older adults, half the world's population is exposed to indoor air pollution at high levels. So it is a concern. When we looked in Bangladesh, a recent paper published, and what we found was that they do crop burning there. And you've probably seen it in the news in India and Bangladesh. At the end of the season, they don't really have tractors to plow up the field, so they light them up and burn the stubble. And and that dominates the mass. If you just go out and weigh the particles and say how many particles, what's the concentration of particles, most of them during these periods is from biomass burning. But when we looked at the effect on mortality and also hospital admissions, we found that the fossil fuel combustion particles with sulfur in them tended to have a much steeper incline. In other words, the risk of dying went up rapidly, whereas for the biomass, they're not non-toxic, but they're far less toxic than fossil fuel particles. So, you don't always want to go after the source that's putting out the most pollution, but you have to consider the toxicity of the particles. And basically these fossil fuel particles are, 5 to 10 times more toxic. And here's basically from a paper that we published recently talking about how fossil fuel combustion particles interact, and they've got all these trace elements in them, as I mentioned, and they've got sulfur dioxide they emit, which forms sulfuric acid, and then that the particles collect it. They have a high surface area, they pick up those gases, and it basically activates these particles, so the metals, and makes them more bioavailable, so that it enhances the toxicity. So you have sort of a double whammy there with the particles having toxic things, and then also sulfur to make it acidic and more dangerous. Before the body can clear them out, they solubilize and go into the bloodstream. And that goes into the bronchioles, as we talked about, and getting down into the alveoli. And then those dissolved metals and reactive oxygen species pass into the bloodstream, and then you get systemic oxidative stress, oxidizing things, and that causes inflammation, which, just about every disease you can think of in the body, having extra inflammation makes it worse. Like, for example, asthma makes asthma worse. That's why, when someone's having an asthma attack, they get anti-inflammatory medicines. Just to quickly mention something about viruses, because I alluded to this, that people can catch things when they're simultaneously exposed to particles. And the thing is, the larger particles If you sneeze, those are very large particles and they settle out right away. But smaller ones, so this is what people were worried about with that, 6 meter distance, or what is it, 6 feet, a couple meters. Yeah, even a couple meters away. I'm sorry, like 6 or 7 feet apart. Well, that protects you, gives you some level of protection, at least if you stay away from the person who's maybe sneezing, because the particles settle out rapidly. But the smaller particles will stay in the air for quite a while and can reach people much further away or who come into the room later in time. And I have here some data from Lisa Brousseau, who is a former student in our program and became a faculty member and has studied this. Shows you how on in years I am that my students are now retired. So anyway, some of them, not all, but so the thing is, when you're breathing, you're putting out these 1 micrometer particles, very, very small particles. And when you're speaking, similarly, you put out some very large particles, like 100 microns. And those 100 microns, they settle out in about 8 seconds. So, if you're, and you have sneezing, it's like 40 and 140. So, it's a matter of seconds before those sneeze particles hit the floor, drop down about, I did these estimates just for how far to go down 2 meters, about 6 feet. But for the 1 micrometer particles, without dilution, if you're in a room without much wind flow, ventilation, they can stay in the air for about 16 hours. So somebody could be in a room, maybe singing, because that really generates a lot of aerosols. So you're generating aerosols all the time. And if you have a virus, then it could remain in the air in that room quite a while. And so you could leave, and then someone else could come into the room a few minutes later, and those particles could still be there. That resulted from, your being in the room if you had, COVID or whatever. So definitely dilution. The old saying is dilution is the solution to pollution, right? So getting more air and ventilation is a really good idea. Another idea that I haven't seen talked about too much, but is if you had fans, ceiling fans, they would tend to blow the particles and then they would impact the walls, and that would reduce the amount of time. So that's something, if you can't actually, like in a classroom or something, it's very difficult to change the ventilation. Putting in, I'd like to see somebody do a study of this, but based on what I understand about aerosols, and I've been studying a long time, I know that the fine particle concentrations go down if someone has a ceiling fan running, because it blows it and they bump into the walls and they stick. So it removes the particles. As I mentioned before, diesel particles are among the most toxic, and I'm getting near the end of my time, so I don't want to run over. And we had done a study of children in New York City and their asthma, and we gave them, this is fairly rudimentary. Now we have much more portable instruments, but we had them take around these backpacks with pumps in them and collected samples. One of the interesting things was we found that their symptoms went up with high pollution days, but the girls were had more symptoms than the boys did from the pollution. And other studies have found this, that they're especially susceptible. In other words, boys tend to have more cases of asthma, the percentage, but the girls seem to be more sensitive to the environmental. And doing that study, they ran an editorial in the New York Times, and that led to stronger idling limits. So research can be turned into action, public health action. And that's what we're hoping that we put in recently a proposal and with Achaia Foundation to do some air sampling. There's no health component to this in and around Eagle Butte, and collaborating with the University of New Mexico. And Esther Erde may add a little bit on this. But one of the things I wanted to mention to pick up on the last talk is that we do plan to use student interns from Lakota College there if we get the funding. So we should be hearing in a few months whether we get funding. And it's to do some air monitoring. And one of the things we'll be measuring is mercury, looking to see if we're getting mercury from those power plant, coal-fired power plants I talked about, which actually circles back for me personally, because when I started in this field as a college student, I was involved with a measurement of mercury in the air. And that led to my getting interested in the topic and going to graduate school with the professor who ran that project. Anyway, so these kinds of studies can be a good opportunity to get those more students interested in an advanced degree in research and that kind of thing. And certainly, I think that if we get this funding, we'll try and reach out to the Tribal Research Agency and collaborate with them, coordinate. So the conclusions, basically, breathing particle air pollution, did it go back? Oh, sorry. Especially fossil fuel combustion can have adverse health effects. Air monitoring studies can document pollution exposure risks. They can identify transported pollution impacts, like I talked about, and can be helpful to tribes in deciding on pollution control steps under their inherent sovereignty. And if you find that pollution from upwind from other states is contributing through studies like this, I'm sure there can be recourse in legal areas. And I've given scientific assistance to nonprofits and the like. I really am of the belief that, in a court of law, everybody in the United States, they're entitled to legal representation. But one of the differences in a lot of cases is that some people, especially vested interests, have lots of money to spend on research, scientists support for their cases. And the community groups and nonprofits don't have that. And so I think we need to start having equal scientific representation in a lot of these environmental cases that that come up. So anyway, if we have time for any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Thanks, Dr. Thurston. We did have one question in the chat we have time to answer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, the question is, what measures need to be instituted to reduce the impact on individuals? And are there different solutions for different pollutants?
Yeah, the second one first. Yes, there are differences but I would say the theme is that the pollutants that come from fossil fuel combustions across the board are really among the greatest concern. So, so you get a lot of different pollutants from them, and it's the mixture that really makes them bad, because they all combine and have effects. So, that's and then what can we do? Well, I think that in the case, it depends where you are. I think most places, traffic and getting cleaner vehicles and reducing traffic, and especially near, let's say, schools. And the tendency in a lot of places is they put the school right next to the highway, so it's easy to get in and off, and that on-off exit, and and also nobody wants to live right next to the highway, so they put the school there, and that's sort of the wrong thinking. We don't want our children in schools that are right next to highways and traffic and pollution. But one of the things that I've done with students, projects, is to have them carry around these inexpensive pollution monitors, a few $100s, and then they figure out, they walk around and all of a sudden they go, whoa, I'm getting exposed. You can't see it a lot of times. Over a long fetch, you can see the haze, right? Or if it's coming right out of a tailpipe, but generally you can't see this pollution. So you have the monitor, you go, oh my gosh, why am I getting a big exposure here? So people can be made more aware of where they're getting their exposures and avoid them. But yeah, it is very site specific, which are the sources. But I would say the theme from my research and my experience has been avoiding fossil fuel combustion, whether that's burning gas for your cooking stove indoors. Electric stoves are much healthier, and if you have a gas stove, to make sure to ventilate it. So that's I think one rule of thumb is to watch out for fossil fuel combustion pollution.